All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for jumping in today. Everyone should be able to see my screen. It's just sort of a simple sort of preview screen of what we're talking about today. I'm Kev Field. I'm one of the directors at Bridge the Gap. And I've asked Linda Jackson, Alison Testroete, Steve Bauer, Gaby Pilote-Fortin to join us today to have a conversation about the business of cycling. So we'll be looking at several areas of the business of cycling, just the overall structure of the sport and how things are organized. And then we'll be going into some really specific things that we think are like really important for athletes to understand how teams are organized and structured, how they go about recruiting, what agents do in the sport of professional cycling, and then for sure the importance of personal brand and developing your own personal brand and how you promote yourself as an athlete. Okay, before we get started, actually, I thought this was one of the most interesting questions we had that was submitted was, what's the single most important thing you should know about the business of cycling? And that was sent in by Felix Robert, who's a young rider from Quebec, second year U23, and he's racing in France for Sable Vendée Cyclisme. He's been over there for quite a while, but I thought Felix's question was really interesting. And at the end of the show, I'm going to sort of kick it back to the panel to say what they think. But for me, I was just going to say what I feel it is. And I feel the single most important thing to understand about the business of cycling right now today is the importance of the Women's World Tour and how fast moving that space in cycling is right now, because I really feel like it has the opportunity to transform the sport. There's one of these little things that I say, and I kind of say all the problems in professional cycling currently are in men's cycling, and all the opportunity is actually in women's cycling. And so the problems in men's cycling are because of some of the sort of structural components and some of the long-standing things that are in place. And there's a few things that are just kind of at loggerheads. And those things actually don't exist in women's cycling, or not to the same degree. And that's why I think it's a super exciting thing to be aware of and follow. And you're actually going to see some of this come through as we speak through the business of cycling today. All right, so next up, I just wanted to give a quick overview of Bridge the Gap. So Bridge the Gap is an organization that was founded in 2013. We help athletes sort of make a progression through the sport of professional cycling. Since 2013, we've invested over 1.3 million to support athletes. We've worked with over 100 athletes. 73% of them make it to a UCI team, and 10% of them make it to the highest levels of the sport, which would be the World Tour or pro-continental levels of cycling. So we typically do 4 things. At Bridge the Gap, we provide direct athlete grants. So we help athletes with financial assistance at really critical parts of their career. We invest in youth cycling. So we sort of seed fund youth clubs across Canada, because we think it's really important to get more kids into the sport of cycling. One of the more important things we've done, just started in the last few years, is mentoring. So we directly mentor athletes and trade teams, more so the athletes. So all the athletes that apply for support or assistance with the fund are paired with a mentor. And Leah Kirschman runs that mentoring program for us. And it's actually been, we think, one of the most impactful and successful things we've done. And in the last 2 years, we've actually been exploring more opportunities to invest in what we just call sort of special projects, which could be just about anything, actually. But we think that's been really important to do, especially during the pandemic, where we've invested in junior projects to go to Europe. And most recently, what we've done, and the reason why Alison Testroete is with us today, is because we think she's developed a super cool program called Athlete to Enterprise, and we're offering some scholarships to up to 5 athletes to go through that program that starts this fall. So with that said, I just want to quickly introduce our panel. So we've got some really key people speaking with us today from Canadian cycling. Just want to stop my screen share. So we've got Linda Jackson. So Linda Jackson and Steve Bauer are both Hall of Fame Canadian cyclists. They're legends of the sport. Linda was 2 times on the podium at the Giro d'Italia. She won the Tour de l'Aude. She's the last Canadian woman to earn a medal at the Road World Championships. She's an Olympian. But more importantly, she's actually been running the longest standing women's trade team in North America. And that's the TIBCO SVB trade team. And she's taking that trade team to the Women's World Tour next year. So we're really fortunate to have Linda here. Steve Bauer is another Canadian cycling legend. His list of achievements are arm's length, so I won't get into them, but he's worn the yellow jersey in the Tour de France and won Olympic and World Championship medals. And then more importantly, what Steve's done since he retired from his athletic careers, he's actually worked to develop trade teams, and he created Canada's first men's pro-continental trade team back in 2011. And since then, he's been working. He actually helped to start the Milton Cycling Academy at the Velodrome in Milton, Ontario. And in the last few years, he's been working back in the Men's World Tour as a head sports director or head performance director for teams like BMC and now Premier Tech Astana. So Alison Testroete, who I already introduced really quickly, Alison was the 2009 Canadian road champion. She actually raced in Europe at the end of her career for, at the time, the team was called Skill Koga, which is now actually the DSM Women's World Tour team. So she was a rider on that team in the early phases of it getting up and started. And since she retired from cycling, she started the Lucca Cycling Club in Italy. And she's actually lived in Europe ever since she ended her career. And in the last few years, she has actually developed Athlete to Enterprise, which is a super interesting program that I'm going to get her to speak about in just a couple of minutes. And our last panelist is Gaby Pilote-Fortin. So Gaby was actually one of the original recipients of the bursaries from the Bridge the Gap Fund. And she's made a really successful career for herself racing in Europe. And she's been in Europe full-time ever since 2013. With one sort of little gap here and there where she came back to North America for a little bit. But one of the most important things that Gaby's done is she's probably one of the most networked Canadians in professional cycling that very few of us have probably heard of. But she's actually done an amazing job of building an incredible personal network. And she really knows the game of how to navigate the team landscape and specifically how agents work. And she even considered starting an agency herself just in the last couple of years. So she's definitely a really valuable source of information for you guys as athletes to understand how that part of the sport works. So with the intro of our panelists, I'm going to kick it over to Alison to actually speak a little bit more about the importance of personal brand and her Athlete to Enterprise program, which we're really excited to be offering some scholarships to some of you guys as athletes. So we encourage you to apply. And with that said, I'll let Alison speak to that.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's I can say it was expected that I would create this program, but the pandemic kind of sprung upon us, and I made the transition myself from being a professional cyclist. I actually worked a little bit in an architecture firm. I guess I couldn't really see that future for myself. And I felt like, Italy was somewhere that I wanted to go, but I knew at that time that I would need to create my own destiny, that I would need to, if I wanted to have the freedom, and like in terms of time, financial, and in the work that I do and the difference that I wanted to make, that I was really going to have to create my own job for myself. So yeah, I made that transition through my travel company, and I saw the growth of myself, just being able to put in the work and then see the results from that. And so then when the pandemic hit, it was definitely devastating, but probably the biggest thing going through my mind, when I was going is I was like, why didn't I start this earlier? Why didn't I kind of build up my brand earlier? And that wasn't really something that, we were taught to do or that we were doing. And so, so it became really important to me to show the way for, younger athletes and athletes coming up, because because I think now with the landscape of the internet and social media, we all have an incredible opportunity to make a name for ourselves and to build a reputation and really to author the difference that we want to see. And so that's, segueing into personal branding. I feel that your brand is, your personal brand is something that you already have inside of you. It's essentially your reputation, and you cultivate and build it through your communication and through the trust that you build through other people. And being an athlete right now, you have the opportunity through the media, through social, and you just have more exposure naturally. And so it's a platform that you can leverage, and you can build upon, and you can create more opportunities for yourself while you're doing it. But it's not an easy area to navigate in terms of building up that brand. So when I think of personal brand, I think of, again, like your reputation and really how you make people feel, and the platform and the audience that you build with that. And so drawing people in based off of the things that matter to you. So it's something that you build from the inside out. It's your values, it's what you stand for, and it's the difference that you want to see. And once you've done that, once you've built up the trust with people, then you can inspire others into action. So what would that action be? Well, kind of the one thing that brands and companies do, it inspires people, to buy things, to purchase things, or, you could raise funds, or you could promote different organizations or causes that you believe in. And with that, you can create a sense of freedom for yourself and other opportunities. So at any point, you may not be thinking right now, I'm sure many athletes on the line, you're probably thinking, well, right now, I don't have any ideas of monetizing my brand. But, once you've kind of built out that platform and the trust, with your audience, then you can pivot at any point, as you progress in your career. If you want to write a book, if you want to start public speaking, if you want to, sell something, like maybe it's a product, maybe it's like what I do. You want to go into travel, or it may not even be an entrepreneurial sense. You can kind of create opportunities for yourself, career-wise, with different job opportunities within sport, much like what Gaby has done. So I think, we all have an incredible opportunity right now to sort of step up and be that change that we want to see within our sport, and then within the world.
Awesome. Thanks, Alison. Maybe I'm actually really curious, and I think some of the guests would be curious to know, just can you run us through a few of the just mechanics or the specifics of the Athlete to Enterprise program, like how long it takes, when it starts, some of the modules and the courseware that everyone's going to get to learn, so we can actually help to promote those scholarships that we're giving away?
Definitely. Yes, of course. So it starts on October 25th. It's a 6-week course, and it's pretty thorough in the sense that it's designed for athletes at whatever stage you're in, whether that's at the very beginning, just creating your brand and trying to figure out what you want to say, what your voice is, and what you want to stand for, to the other end of the spectrum, whether you're running a coaching business alongside your your athletic career. And so the first module is all really about getting clear on your profit and understanding, the brand and your values and the positioning of yourself and your brand, and just really knowing the numbers of your business, the numbers of what it takes to raise professionally at in terms of recovery and training and all the different costs that you have as an athlete. So it's certainly not something I was taught, and I maybe wish I was taught. And then the second is onto website. So a big part of building out like my travel company from nothing is just knowing how to build my own site, knowing how, just to build a very basic site and to start building a mailing list. And I know this may be a hot topic in a world of social media, but I'm a big proponent of building your following on a platform that you own. So that's also a part of the program. And then the third is communication. So, just learning how, to message, to formulate your message, and to design your communication strategy. And then from there, it goes on to relationship building in module 5, where we talk about, again, building up your network and just being strategic about it right from the start, how to nurture those relationships, and then build out a peer group while you can. Peers, not necessarily your competitors, but your colleagues, and how you can grow within your sport, with that group of people. And then the sixth one is probably for the more advanced students, but just how to sell and market yourself as an athlete, negotiate, and how basically to bring the money in, which is ultimately what you need. And so I would say, yeah, I mean, there's different pieces that each athlete may take from it and may, apply. But I think for me, the biggest lesson, or the biggest thing that I went through, and probably the biggest payoff, is understanding what value I had as a business owner, and how to position that for people, the value, and then of course sell it so that I can support myself, and so I can, build out my business, and I can create that freedom in my life.
Awesome. Thanks a ton, Alison. Okay, so I'm going to, and I promise this is the boring stuff of the conversation today, and I'm going to keep it as short and sweet as possible. So one of the things that I think is actually important for athletes to understand as they sort of navigate the world of cycling is just how it's all organized. So I think everybody's heard of the UCI. So the UCI is the international or global governing body of the sport. It's divided into 5 confederations with 194 national federations across the world. The confederations are essentially the different continents. But inside the UCI, you've got commissions that work on specific things related to the sport of cycling. And the most important one for professional cycling and for professional road cycling is the PCC, or the Pro Cycling Council. And that group within the UCI works with outside stakeholder groups to develop the regulations that sort of govern professional cycling, how it works. Some of the most important ones of those are the joint agreements, the rules of racing. And I encourage all you guys as athletes, I know this stuff is super boring and I'm not going to sort of go into a rules seminar, but definitely go to the UCI website and pull down on a sort of an annual or every 2 years basis the rules for cycling, so you can just sort of see and understand some of the changes. And I do think the joint agreements are an important thing for any athlete who aspires to be a professional in the sport, to understand what's inside the joint agreements, because as an athlete, that's actually where you see a lot of the rights that you have and how teams should be working with you, and what the obligations of the teams are to you as an individual rider. And the PCC sort of liaises and works with these organized outside groups. So you've got groups that are organized around teams. So you've got things like the AIGCPP, which is the Association Internationale de Groupes Cyclistes Professionnels, and then this new group called VELEN, which is trying to sort of reshape professional cycling from a team's perspective. There's athlete representation groups, which you could consider them to be almost like de facto unions. One is super dysfunctional. It's called the Cyclistes Professionnels Alliance, and it's the men's representation group. And it's like really sort of chaotically organized with lots of national divisions, and it's actually really complicated to navigate. And then there's a new group called the Cyclist Alliance, which is started by a retired Dutch professional named Iris Slappendel, and she put it together around 2014. I can't remember the exact year, but in that really short period of time, she's actually done amazing work. And this sort of traces back to that thing that I think is the most important thing to know now. Because it's really moving fast and it's providing lots of super valuable information for female professional cyclists. And Iris is starting to branch out beyond just road cycling. There's the organizers group. So it's an international group of organizers that sort of work with the UCI on sort of the calendaring, sort of when races happen. And they organize 2,300 events a year across the world. There's agents that are regulated and now required to be licensed by the UCI. So there's a lot of compliance that goes on inside the sport of professional cycling in terms of how agents work. And then there's lots of industry outreach and industry representation. And as we all know, as bikers, there's tons and tons of kind of technical regulations as it relates to positions in time trial, positions on a road bike, the dimension of tubes and what we can and can't do in terms of how the equipment works. So there's a special group inside the UCI that works specifically about that and reaches out to industry groups. And then there's one group that I think is interesting in its omission. And there's no actual specific outreach in professional cycling to deal with the media, which I think is actually really interesting. But the media would definitely be a really important stakeholder group in professional cycling. So that's the sort of the overall structure of the sport of cycling. And then I think something that's really important for athletes to understand is sort of the global nature of how teams work and function and operate. So since 1998 in men's professional cycling, we've had a 3-tier system that's gone through different sort of reforms or variations in how we call things from a 3rd-tier trade team to a 2nd-tier to world teams or world tour teams or pro continental, but effectively it's been the same since 1998. Then I think it's really important for guys in the sport of cycling to just sort of understand like how big it is, like what's the scale of it all. So it's important to realize that on any given year, there's just over 3,000 guys that are sort of ranked or classified in the global ranking of the UCI across the 6 different continental racing circuits. In any given year, it kind of goes up or down, but you've got around about 220 teams. But at the very top, which is where Bridge the Gap does its work, trying to get athletes up into what we would consider professional cycling, which is pro continental and world tour. You've got 18 world tour teams, and in any given year, between 18 to 25, 27 professional continental teams. And what we do at Bridge the Gap is help Canadian athletes sort of navigate through that first or 3rd tier of about 2,300 athletes. So we can get Canadian athletes who can sort of move into that top 10% in that level, and gives them a really good chance to boost up into the professional levels of the sport. On the women's side, this is why things are super exciting. We had a single tier system or structure for years and years and years and years. And ever since 2016, when the UCI started to really try to evolve the Women's World Tour, it's been moving super, super fast. So the first step to modernize and professionalize women's cycling was to develop the Women's World Tour as a race series, a calendar series in 2016. And then just last year was the first time we saw women's world tour teams come into the picture. So it's actually had sort of an interesting dynamic on what we're seeing in terms of the number of teams and the number of athletes in women's professional cycling. So where we used to have somewhere around sort of 830, 850 sort of ranked or classified riders in the global rankings, we're now touching over 1,000. We've seen teams come up from about 46 to 79. 9 of those teams are now world teams or world tour teams. That number is growing. And we can get Linda to talk a little bit about that. But this is a really, really fast moving space in professional cycling right now. And I think it's an exciting time to be a female professional cyclist. But it's also a part of the sport that I think everybody who's working inside the sport should actually start to pay a lot more attention to, because it can move really, really quickly. And in some ways, what I've seen happening in cycling is actually, it's got some real similarities to the early 1970s when Billie Jean King sort of revolutionized tennis and actually really kind of did a lot of lobbying for equity for female tennis players. And that really changed the sport of tennis into what we see today. And I see the same thing happening right now with some of these really sort of key players like Iris and others inside women's cycling who are doing a really good job of elevating the sport. And we're seeing it happening everywhere now, where when you look at sort of the media around professional cycling, who's watching what, we're seeing more and more and more the women's races are getting as many, or in some cases, even more television viewers and more spectators watching women's cycling than men's cycling. So I think it's women's cycling is moving fast, and it's a super interesting product because it's exciting racing, and it's racing that is maybe a little bit more in tune with how spectators want to sort of sit down on a weekend afternoon and watch a sport. You know, where men's cycling, it's awesome and it's rich in its history, and we all love seeing those 7-hour races, but it's hard to sit down in front of a TV and watch a bunch of guys ride their bikes for 7.5 hours or 6.5 hours. And the women's racing tends to be a lot more dynamic and a lot more sort of TV friendly. And we're starting to see that, you know, in terms of spectator and viewership and what people are actually watching and consuming. So I think this is a really cool area of the sport right now. So now with that said, I actually did want to do a little bit of talking about teams and how teams are sort of structured and organized. And that's what, it's awesome that we got Linda and Steve here. So like in the simplest sense, I think teams are, you can sort of think about teams as being organized sort of in two areas. On the one side, you've got the sporting aspects of a team, you know, where you've got your sport directors and your coaches and your athletes and your technical staff that support the riders at the bike races. And then you have sort of the back office or the business and business administration side of the sport. And the smaller the team, the more you see people that do multiple roles with inside an organization. And then the bigger the team, the more those roles sort of get blown out and expanded. But I thought it'd be really great to talk to both Linda and Steve about how they've seen teams be sort of structured and organized on both the sporting and the business side. So Steve, I'll sort of kick it over to you because you've got a ton of insights you can share.
Recruiting athletes right now, structure.
Yeah, let's talk about structure and especially the sporting structure in terms of the sports directors and the performance services teams and how that works at the World Tour and how it differs between you know, like when we were Spider Tech and Spider Tech in its continental phases to what you see now at the top of the sport.
Yeah, so in the recent, say, 5 years working on the World Tour, I worked for two different what they call paying agents or the organizations that manage World Tour teams. And both of those structures are probably, including the athletes, which on the World Tour now is a minimum 28 riders, plus staff, tops out probably around plus or minus 80 people. So, you know, sort of from top down, you would have the general manager, which is the overseer of the paying agent or the organization. You would have what they call a sporting manager, which is typically responsible for the director of sport group or the DS's, sport directors, as they call them. On our current team, we're 7. And that could vary from, you know, being 7 director sportifs to, you know, more than 10 or a dozen on a World Tour team, depending on how they do, like full-time or some part-timer DSs, but mostly it probably between 7 and 12. The therapist group, which is the soigneurs, the mechanics group, the doctor group, you know, physio or osteopaths, which could be, you know, part-timers coming in per race, or they may be full-time. Public relations, communications. So it's really, you know, when you build it all out, it's a lot like any corporate structure in the way it's built out. Different roles of the different responsibles. Typically, when you think about the sports side, you would have a management group, which would be likely the GM, you know, head doctor, head therapist, head, perhaps the director of sportives would be involved in the whole decision-making process of how, you know, you build out the calendar year, which riders are going where. At BMC and CCC, which was Continuum Sports, we had a really good collaborative model where the sport group would sit down, you know, plan the season, think about rider rosters, build out, you know, templates and spreadsheets of how we best would utilize our assets, so to speak, all the athletes going to certain goals, whether it be the classics, the Giro d'Italia, the Tour de France. So you basically take a look at the whole season and say, okay, how's this going to play out? And it's quite a complex spreadsheet when you think about, say if you add up, like maybe with BMC, we did 250 team race days, and then each rider in that race days would do about, say, between 65 and 80 maximum races per day. So you go through a lot of scenarios of how you would build out the best case plan, and going forward you have to adapt it as you go. So trainers, I don't think I mentioned the trainer group. Also, you'd have a head trainer. In BMC, it was rider assignments. So, for example, one trainer would take 8 athletes, another trainer would take 10 athletes, and you would divide that up within the structure. So there wasn't really, in that group, there wasn't any sort of personal training happening outside the organization. We kept things tight within the organization, and our trainers would take care of our athletes. Our doctors would take care of our athletes. Our directors would take care of our athletes, and so it was all that, like, in-house. So the way that was
Steve, I think that's super interesting also to maybe kind of like actually go over to Linda, because so as the team gets bigger, they have kind of like I would say 2 operating models where they do everything in-house in terms of all the athlete services and care, from coaching or training, as it's often called at the World Tour, to paramedical support, to the sports directors and the calendaring. Now, as a team is depending on the size of the organization and moving from racing a little bit more on a continental circuit to the World Tour, those structures they grow and they scale out. So Linda, you're actually in the process of taking a look at this specifically. Maybe you can talk to us a tiny bit about what you're seeing right now with TIBCO moving to more of a full-time world team, and how that differs from how you've been operating TIBCO sort of in the preceding 5-6 years as you've been building up to this growth and development of your organizational structure.
Sure. As a Conti team, we've been racing in Europe since 2010, but we've been racing in Europe really with a US model. We had one mechanic, one soigneur, one director, and they did everything. As we go to World Tour status, it's a whole different ballgame. I think the most important thing for the athlete, from the athlete's perspective, is that we gain, it's a requirement by the UCI to have a performance director. And so we've just hired our high performance director, whose job will be to really be the liaison between the riders and the team, manage calendars and rosters and things like that. And he's actually a Canadian, Chris Rozdilski. So very happy to bring him on board. But I would say that's the biggest change for us, is the increased infrastructure for the riders. High performance director will have 2 directors, 2 Swannies, 2 mechanics. Just a lot more staff to take care of the riders is the biggest difference.
Yeah. And are you going to be running a hybrid structure with your program, Linda? So will you have sort of the rider coaching will be outside coaches, and the performance director, Chris, will sort of be liaising with those external coaches, or will you have all your...
We're going to have, I find with women, they really do like to have their own coaches. And so that's the model we're going to adopt. We let everybody keep their own coaches. If somebody wants to be coached by Chris, we can certainly entertain, but everyone will keep their own coaches, and Chris will liaise with those coaches.
Okay. And then I think I guess the other important thing to talk about in terms of team structures is also how teams will typically go about athlete recruitment. And so this is where actually, Gaby, I want to kind of fold you into the conversation super quick to give us a high level overview on how agents work, like what they do and don't do, how they operate and function.
Yeah, so agents, they can have like 2 main forms. So they can be either you can work with individual independent agent or with an agency. But in general, agents are regulated by the UCI. So, and then the role is to basically introduce rider to a team or an organizer, to sign a professional contract, whether it is for being a professional cyclist or to be a part of an event where you're sponsored by. And these regulations, they don't apply to lawyers that are legally authorized to practice in compliance with the rules in force in their country of domicile, or to parents, brothers, sisters, or spouses of the athletes. And basically, this is the reason why the UCI is regulating this, is to prevent abuse and to make sure that the rider's rights, happiness, and safety is always the main focus. So with that said, you can work with either independents, like I said, or agencies. So independent could be a lawyer or your family members that, for example, work within cycling and have a network already, or more like professional independent agents like Giuseppe Acquattro, for example, who works with riders like Egan Bernal. But you can also work with talent agencies and sport agencies like SEG Racing, Corso, Trinity Cycling, just to name a few of them. But there's definitely a lot more agencies that are growing in the last years, especially with women's cycling. There's a lot more of those individuals that are starting women-specific representation agencies. The main difference between those independent agents and the agencies is the level or the portfolio of services that they can provide. So an independent will typically just represent you in front of teams and sponsor. So they'll try to help you out with whatever you need, but a lot of those extra services that a rider might need doesn't have anything to do with getting you into a team will be outsourced. So there's pros and cons to that. If you're a rider that only needs to find a contract, maybe this can be a better option. But if you're a rider that needs, for example, for Canadian riders who also have to deal with visa, and things like this, it's good to have an agency that have many services in-house, because they actually don't just represent you in front of a team, but they can also provide different kind of services like branding, media, visa, immigration, so these are the main difference between the two, entities.
Yeah, I think that's super important to make note that the agents can provide a suite or a range of services, and it's important to know what they can and can't do for you. But Linda and Steve, I'm curious to see from you guys, from your perspective. So when it comes to recruiting, we all know that inside teams will build our recruiting list. So we're looking at our roster every year and what we need and what we're looking for, if it's a ruler, a sprinter, a strong support player for the mountains, or this type of race or that type of race. But how important is it for you guys to work with agents? And do you enjoy working with agents? What are some of the pros and cons you see when you're building your roster and looking at your team for the upcoming season to work with agents? And I'll start with you, Linda, your experience with agents.
So I really hadn't had any experience with agents until this year. And I've got a pretty mixed opinion, and I'll try and be politically correct on this call. I think agents can be helpful, but I think they can also get in between serious conversations with the rider. I always want to talk to the rider and get to know the rider. Some agents are less willing to have those conversations than others. So it's been hit or miss so far. I think my preference is definitely to work with the rider. And I think, and the riders have different viewpoints too. The agent's going to take 7 to 10% of their first year salary. And I guess every agent's different. So if you're an accomplished rider, you probably don't need that agent. But it's personal preference. So I'm mixed. I'm not a huge fan so far. But it takes the pressure off the rider when negotiating dollars. Some people are uncomfortable talking about dollars, and so the agent can really play that role for the rider.
That's a super good point. Steve, what's your experience with agents?
Well, it hasn't been my role to speak directly with agents. I do know a few. This year with Astana Premier Tech, I was placed in a position to work with Giuseppe Martinelli when they tried to kick Vino out of the picture. But yeah, so that's a straight story. So I was then talking with agents for the future of the team. It was in there. I had interesting conversations with agents. Some guys I think are quite straight, honest. Others they're probably more old school and business minded, less objective about an athlete's career, and it's more like a financial transaction, and where the rider should go to get the most money, etc. So I think the system, unfortunately, in just my short impression, is not very good. But that's also the business of our sport at the high level has quite a few flaws, I think, in the business model of professional cycling. And it's really slow to change, right? So there's some ingrained agents in the men's world tour, speaking about, that have huge portfolios of top riders that really influence negotiations and where riders are placed. And the teams, I think, find sometimes the agents have a little bit too much power in sort of the marketplace. That's my impression in a short time.
Okay,
but for, like, speaking about like new riders, young riders, coming into the game, I think in the high and trying to make progress in a professional world, I think the agency probably is not the first key. I think the first key is due diligence and maintaining good files on yourself, good results files, resumes. Obviously social media is probably is important. As Alison talked about, your contact list, your reach of people, because I think inevitably, your contact lines, are going to be potentially the most helpful ones to get noticed, right? So Kev, that people will call you, they'll call me, they'll reach out. Do you know somebody that can contact, send my resume to? So these portfolios, and beyond your own kind of results and skills and the abilities that you built up as an athlete, probably more key than that agency step, at least in the first go. Now, agent can help maybe also, because they have the direct contact with all the general managers of the teams. So yeah, it's a bit of a balance. I think if you choose an agent, choose them well. Choose them well, like Gaby says. Do your research, due diligence, speak to people, get referrals, just like anything. It's it's not a light step. Yeah, I need an agent, I'll take that one. I think it's key.
Yeah, and I think so. To kind of like I'm going to kick it back to Gaby here in a sec, but I think what we're hearing from Linda and Steve is that there's pros and cons to working with agents. It's really important for the rider themselves to know what that agent will do and how they'll work with you. And it's really important for athletes to understand that they absolutely still have some skin in the game. Like, they need to do their own work when they're reaching out to teams as well, and work with your agent to do that. One of the things that I think is really important to know about agents, and this is where I'm going to ask Gaby another direct question, is what the work of an agent, and sort of naturally what they're compelled to do, is they have to come forward to a team sort of with a slate of riders that they think are compatible with that team. So they understand what that team is looking for in terms of skill sets for different riders, and it's the same whether it's a first tier or a continental team. So if you're a junior or U23 and you're riding in that continental space, or even going up to the world tour, teams need certain types of riders for the coming season, and the agents can be really good at understanding what the teams are actually looking for, and they bring forward this slate. And what happens inevitably when they do that is there's a little bit of playing rider A off against rider B. So they're bringing in the kinds of riders the team is looking to see, but they're also not always working 100% in your individual best interests as a rider. And I think that's important. And it's just kind of a nature of their business. But Gaby, I'm curious to hear from you how you feel, how you would suggest that athletes sort of navigate around that, you know, understanding that an agent is not just going to be bringing you to a team, but he's going to be, or she's going to be bringing sort of like 3 to 5 riders to a team, and how they're going to sort of play off that slate, and how you make sure as an athlete you're kind of appropriately represented.
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to try to combine everybody's, because those are all really interesting points. Like you said, agents, they have a big portfolio of athletes, especially the big agencies. And not only they have a big portfolio, but sometimes, and it happens quite often, that they have deals with teams, because agents, what they want to do, like their objective at the end of the year is to place all the riders that they sign for contract. So they have deals with teams to get the most of their clients into contracts. And so that means that, if you're not like a top tier athlete, maybe because you're not the one directly driving the boat, you might end up with a deal that is not as good as if you had negotiated yourself. But it is less stressful to have somebody else do it for you, because they're taking that pressure off your shoulders, and you can really focus on your riding and your training and your performances. So I think it's a fine balance to know yourself, to know your needs, and also to be aware of that, the fact that maybe the salary will be a bit less, but it's not all about the salary either. It's about, the agents, like you said, they know the teams and they know the philosophy behind every teams that they work with. And if you're really transparent with your agent, they will also know your personality, and they will know ahead of time whether you fit or not with a team. But the other reason why it's, like Linda said, it's so important to talk to a team yourself is that the agent will never be capable of telling you how you feel about a manager or a team. Like, you have to have this direct conversation with a team to know if you can cooperate and work, because we spend so much time on the road with the teams. If you don't spend that time to get to know them, then you will never know if you're going to be happy. And if a decision, even though the salary might be higher, maybe you're not going to be a happy athlete. And so maybe you won't get any results. And so you have to think about your career as like a long-term investment. And so the short-term salary might not be the most interesting deal for you. And the agents sometimes, like especially the old school ones, they will only think about their cut. And especially if you make money. The advantage of working with a big agency is that, for example, a lot of them don't charge female cyclists because they know of the situation within the sport, and they also won't charge neo pros that haven't reached a reasonable salary. So there are also pros and cons about like the percentages, but they will also always try to find more money for themselves as well. So that's something to keep in mind. I think like the best strategy is always to take the responsibility for your own career first and to make the first move to a team. I know sometimes it's a bit nerve-wracking and it's a bit uncomfortable to go ahead and reach out to a team yourself. But when you do that, you also show the team that you're interested in them. And then when it comes to the point of like, reaching out and keeping the contact with them, you can use your agent to do that step for you. But I think like when you do that, because you show up yourself first in the team, there's not another rider going against you. Like if you ask your agent to reach out to the team themselves, because when they reach out, they'll reach out, like you said, with more than one athlete. But if you're the one who's making the first step, it's only you. And then the agent will just kind of follow up with the team about you, especially.
Yeah, I think another important point to kind of get out there today with everyone is, and this is back to Linda and Steve. So when you guys are recruiting for the coming season, how many athletes would have contacted you, and how big would your recruiting list be? Sort of in kind of really objective numbers. Like, would you have like 100 riders that you're looking at, or 50 or 30? So I'll kind of start with Linda. So Linda, like how many riders do you think, would you say contact TIBCO every year looking for a position in the team? And what's your, when you do your first filter to sort of pare it down to X number of riders that you're specifically looking at, how big would both those lists be?
So I'd say hundreds contact us. Hundreds, especially this year. It's been insane. The filter list, I'm just looking in my mind, is probably about 30 that are on the possible list. And there's a top tier, and then a second tier, and then on par with our current riders. So we'll never hire somebody that's on par with our current riders. We'll just stay with the current rider. So we're really looking above those steps.
Okay.
And then the filter, I use Chris for now, the high performance director. It used to be guesswork. You know, you'd look at a rider, you'd look at all their attributes, and you kind of guess about what they could do. And it's hit or miss. With a high performance director, you're looking at power numbers. You're having him look at those training peak files, and he'll give us a scientific background. And then we look at personality, social media, all the other stuff.
Yeah. And Steve, how big would your lists be?
Well, that depends on which team you're talking about. Because the most recent team that I work for, well, now I'm currently employed with, is, I think is actually doing a terrible job. But when they put me involved, I immediately spent about a week creating like a professional list of existing pros that were available for contract, and I got to about 80 through the week. There's probably more, and you know, ongoing. So I started to build a list basically with my own sort of evaluation in different skill sets, right? Climber, World Tour winner, Grand Tour stage winner, Classics guy, etc. And then I also started looking at also the younger talent. So I put them in categories: young talent, also that aren't World Tour yet, and put those in evaluation. And then I started talking to agents and to figure out which of these guys were in which agency. And I also had some eye on some of the riders I was kind of following, Canadians and or international guys. And then I got data files from those agents, right? Get how do you say, approval or okay to be able to, yeah, permissions to get the files. And then I would send them, as Linda says, to the high performance manager. So I'd send them, in our case, to the head trainer, those guys are evaluating data files, etc. But you know, I didn't get further than that with this group because it's kind of, you know, coming apart. But BMC was a well-established organization for, you know, 10 years before I actually joined them, and our recruitment strategy was usually a meeting in right after Paris-Roubaix for the following year, looking at which riders would come available. It was also a bit head trainer led, head trainer, head performance manager led. But inevitably, I think both those organizations were actually quite weak in their really a full-fledged recruitment strategy, scouting strategy. I think it was not, for a professional organization that, you know, they're invested in sponsorship, let's say 20 million euros a year for each team. I find they're both weak. You know, maybe there's certain teams that have better models, better evaluation processes, but you know, in like sort of a week and a half, I started to build one for Astana Premier Tech because, yeah, they just didn't have anything as far as I know, or at least they weren't sharing it with me.
Yeah. So I know we've got about 5 minutes before Linda needs to bounce, and we will keep going. If everybody's interested staying on, we're going to continue the conversation because I think we're talking about some really good stuff, and we've got a rare opportunity to talk to some pretty credentialed people. But I like still on this vein of recruiting and getting noticed by teams. And now that everybody understands, like, and I will say also from like a Conti level. So when I was a sports director with a team like Optum Kelly Benefits, the women's team, or working with Steve with Spider Tech, or previously with Symmetrics, or even Axel Merckx with Trek Livestrong. Even at a North American Conti level, you're often looking at 60 to 80 athletes. And so you're sort of sorting them into the category of athlete they are and how they can fit within the team and what you're actually looking for, if you're looking for sprinters or climbers or GC riders, etc. But those lists are big. Those lists are big. And I think teams are notorious about being very uncommunicative. Like riders will reach out, send an email, and never get a response back. I think it's really important for you guys to know as athletes that those emails actually do get read. Like, so people are reading them, even though they may not be replying. But I think, when you put together your profile and how you're trying to present yourself to a team, before Linda has to jet, I really want to ask her, like, Linda, if there's a few key things, like what kind of stands out to you when you get that email from an athlete looking for a spot on Tibco? Who are the athletes where you get that first message and you're like, wow, this athlete is really switched on. I really like what I'm seeing here. And now I'm kind of talking a little bit more about how they present, sort of that initial email, that cover letter, or that communication, because we know that it's important that they've got the results profile and credibility that you're looking for, and the physiological profile that you're looking for. But how do athletes really stand out from a personality perspective so that they kind of get to the top of that pile?
So a couple of quick don'ts. Don't send mass emails and BCC everybody looking for a job. And don't call me Kathy or Joan or some other name. My name is Linda. No, but seriously, the ones that stand out to me are ones that have done some research into who we are. They know who this team is. They know we've been around for 17 years. They know our background. That doesn't take long to look up Team Tibco and find out some history. The other thing that stands out to me is the athlete. A quick no for me is reading a resume that says, I did this, I want to do that, I'm good, all that. It's about a team. And athletes need to understand from the get-go that it's how you fit into the team and how you achieve the team's objectives. This is a business, especially at the World Tour level. We have millions of dollars now of sponsors that are trying to achieve their goals. So the athlete needs to understand it's about more than racing. It's about achieving the team's objectives. So you need to understand the sponsors of the team. You need to know about the team and show how you fit into achieving the team's goals. Those are the ones that stand out.
Steve, so it's a little bit different on the World Tour, but if you can sort of frame Jack back to
that's really excellent what Linda said. It's right on mark. And I think that continental teams and pro continental teams probably get a lot more direct resume solicitation, let's call it, to be on the team. I think more than the World Tour, because the World Tour is by default working with a lot of agencies, right? Unless they're, like I mentioned before, looking at younger athletes that are, from junior to continental or continental to continental pro, where they may be World Tour ready, and we're looking for those gems, that are going to be the next top performers on the World Tour, and those ones are probably either looking at an agency, or their results are already showing, they're already shining through. So there may be multiple teams looking for them. But there's a lot less, I think, direct, email solicitation directly to the World Tour teams. It's probably more through agencies and more through contacts. And that's probably why the contact list and your sort of realm of who's going to look out for you and speak up for you and say, hey, this rider has been doing some great stuff in Spain and France this year. You should really take a look at him for World Tour. If it's not next year, the year after. This kind of contact, so that raises eyebrows of the general manager, the sport manager, the trainer, because sometimes it is who that makes a difference. Unfortunately, that's how sometimes the corporate world works, and cycling is no different.
Yeah, I agree. So just I've said this at different types of sort of chats or talks that I've given over the last few years, but I'll just say it again to everybody who's on the call today. Like, I think there's three things that are really important to sort of get noticed by teams, you know, and I always say one is a big result, like something that the teams are going to take a look at and they're going to go, wow, like, wow, look at that athlete, look at that rider. The second is a consistency of performance, you know, so beyond the big result, and especially now if teams have lists of 60, 80 or more athletes that they're looking at, their teams are looking for athletes that have consistency. And the third thing that Steve just touched on, Linda touched on, and everybody's touched on is a network. You know, you have to build connections and build relationships inside the sport and be, you know, appropriate and proactive about doing that, you know, and your agent can be a part of helping you develop that network. But really, at the end of the day, it really is you as the individual athlete who is super important to do that for yourself. And that's something, you know, that we at Bridge the Gap, we also help with that, you know, so like we tapping into our networks on your behalf as athletes.
Hey, Kevin, can I make one more point and then I'm going to have to leave?
Sure, go for it.
For the women, on the women's side, if you're looking for a job now in the Women's World Tour, you're about 6 months too late. I don't know if it was because of the 6 licenses being granted this year, but teams are hiring in April and May. So as you think about moving next year, looking for a job on the World Tour, you've got to start early. Seriously, teams are doing this in April. Start early, be persistent, but don't be pushy. If you don't hear from a team for a few weeks, try again. It just means they're probably busy, but start early because it's super competitive out there. That's it. I enjoyed this. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Linda. Really appreciate that you jumped on. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Yep.
Linda.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye. Bye, guys.
So now I actually want to ask another question of Gaby and Steve, and it's a question that was submitted for us through some of the athletes. And it's just like, how much are we seeing today that teams are looking at social media? So when teams are actually doing sort of the character checking on athletes, how much is social media becoming important? And how much are teams actually looking at that now? So maybe I'll start with Gaby.
Wow, that's a good question. Actually, I don't know if I can answer probably because I'm not a team, but on the athlete's perspective, I guess my best guess would be that teams will try to, especially if your contact, your name came through like one of your connection or your agent, they will try to understand who you are as a person, as an individual, how you present yourself in the public, and they will try to guess if your personality fits with the team's personality. So obviously, you know, if you're super loud and you're very controversial, that might make some teams uncomfortable, or some teams might really like that you have a very loud personality. So I think yeah, they will try to look on one side at your social media as like who you are as an individual and how you present yourself. And also, you know, like in a more business perspective, they will see it like, what is your engagement with the audience? Like how many people are following you, but also how engaged those followers are with you. So like, are you somebody who's a very big, you know, spokesperson for a cause or whatever? And are you going to drive a lot of traffic to the team channels, for example? And that can be, in a business side of things, that can be very attractive to some teams. But I think the sport haven't developed to there yet. So I think more and more teams understand the importance of the social media and all the business opportunity that they can get from it. But a lot of teams are also very old school, even like the top teams in the way they are organized and they manage things. So they still don't quite understand how to use social media to create business opportunity for them. And so, yeah, it depends, I guess, like how old the team is and how it operates, and like what they're going to do or what they're going to use your social media with. But for sure, they're looking at it for some reason. So I think it's important to be, and that's also why it's important to think about things like Alison is doing to really understand how to build a brand and like all a content base that is the best representation of who you are as an athlete. And that will also higher chances at being, having more engagement and having more followers, because if you are very smart about how you build up your social media, then people will be more interested in following up and not leaving your platform.
Yeah. So Steve, I know probably right now at Premier Tech Astana, social media and looking at what the riders are doing online or not is probably like a little bit lower down. But I think when we were working together at Spider Tech, we were in some ways at the forefront of trying to explore how we could use social media to promote the team, promote our riders within the team, and promote what we were trying to do. So can you talk a little bit about some of those differences and what you're seeing now, sort of from BMC World Tour to Spider Tech, and how you see teams looking at social media right now?
Well, I think that I agree with everything that Gaby says. I think it's if an athletic profile, beyond their skill set, their athletic ability, their performance, that's visible in results. One sports psychologist once told me that you have to use that in order to achieve your goals. You need to really use everything you can that's at your fingertips to achieve your goal. And so having a respectable social media platform is just, this is the modern profile of people that are in the public eye. And you'd think that it would be more important on the World Tour than it is. I think some teams obviously do a better job than the teams I've been on. The team I'm on now is we have a good communications manager, but as far as recruiting goes, I think it's very, like, at least on the teams I've worked with at the World Tour, and these are only two examples. The social media profile of the person is pretty low on the scale for hiring contract. At least that's my experience of just two teams. So 2 at 18, that's a pretty low percentage of a model. But going back to the importance of it, I think we're a sponsor driven enterprise, and so marketing, branding, eyeballs on social media posts, attachment, good, respectable influencers, you call it. It's all important, whether or not a World Tour team uses it to their advantage or not is the question. So, as a smaller pro Conti team, Spider Tech, powered by Planet Energy, we were, like, as you say, Kev, you being technologically capable to create these platforms, and our guys knowing that this was so important for our sponsors and driving our brand, driving our mission was really key. Now established World Tour team that's that's government funded, like Kazakhstan, Astana. It'd be really important for Premier Tech, but for Kazakhstan, they don't care at all. So it's not a model to reflect upon as very good. But I would agree with Gaby that it's important. It's an important piece of an athletic profile, and people should take it seriously because it's only going to help. Because, like I said, use everything to your advantage, in a positive way.
So, Alison, I think this is a great opportunity to sort of get your perspective on this as well. Because now social media is so important for developing a personal brand these days, or can be. And if possible, I don't know if I saw her that she's still in here. I don't know if she's still here, but Alison Jackson is also on the call. And it might be neat to have the two Alisons talk about some of the work you guys have done together and how you guys view social media in terms of creating a personal brand, a character, letting people know who you are personally, how far you can take it and where you should pull back, and some of the things to avoid and some of the things to really do. Because I think, in Canada, we're actually It's surprising. We've got a couple of athletes that I think have done an exceptional job with social media and being fun, engaging influencers, and really getting their name out there. And AJ is one for sure. So I don't know if AJ can unmute, and the two of you guys can talk a little bit about personal branding and social media, and perhaps some of the work you guys have actually done together as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I don't know if Alison's on the call. I guess I feel pretty strongly about it. I see social as a tool that you should use it strategically. I'm a big fan of this guy. His name is Cal Newport, that talks about deep work, and your ability to focus is probably one of the most important things in terms of, you know, doing hard things and doing things that matter. And social, like scientifically, you know, it's meant to be addictive because it's, you know, it's owned by Facebook, and the more users that they have on the platform, the better their business model works. And so it's not that I'm definitely for social, and I think it's a great way that you can build up your following, and it's something that you absolutely should use as a tool, you know, to connect with people and to connect with bigger audiences, especially since you know, a lot of the sponsors and a lot of your peers and yeah, I mean, a lot of people are on it. There's lots of traction on it, but I'm also a big fan of, like I said earlier, of building a platform that you own, which is your email list, and it's kind of why most big businesses do that. So if you can get a direct line, you know, with your, you know, your most important sponsors, your biggest fans, the people who really, you know, want to hear from you, then you don't really have to worry about those like the engagement and people not seeing your posts. So yeah, I think it's something that you use strategically in tandem with an email list. That's my perspective on it, and I've seen, I suppose, the results in my business that way. But I mean, I think Alison, she's done an amazing job at you know, creating kind of a niche for herself, like really letting her personality shine and connecting to people. You know, just I recently read an article about her. Just, you know, I think the pressure's on to be a certain way in such a traditional sport. And so I think she's done an amazing job to just differentiate herself through the videos that she does. And so yeah, I actually coached Alison her first year as a professional cyclist. God, when was that? I think it was like in 2014, 2015.
Yeah, 2015.
Yeah. So that's how we know each other. But yeah, lots of fun. Yeah.
Awesome.
So I don't know if she's going to pop on and.
No, so just so everybody knows, like I kind of put AJ on the spot, but she's actually on her bike, and she can't sort of come on but with audio because she's riding her bike right now, and we hear lots of wind and background noise. But so Alison, I'm curious also to understand, like I mean, the big thing that you're consistently saying is the importance of building your own network and your website as well. But I think right now it's another thing that could be interesting for the athletes to know, and we've got several questions about it, is are there any particular social media platforms that we see as being more important than others right now in the sport of cycling and with personal branding? And actually, I like Gaby and Alison, you guys could both comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go first, but I think Gaby's probably, I mean, would be kind of my opinion. I'm not really a social media star. It's not like something that I use while I was racing. It's certainly not maybe a tool that I max out right now. But I think that, you know, in my perspective, is choose one that you really like, one that suits you, and just master it instead of being spread out on, you know, all the platforms, feeling like you have to do Twitter and then Instagram and then TikTok and then Facebook and all the other ones. Is just, you know, just choose one and really master it. And, you know, the one that you like the most.
I have a bit of I mean, like, I'll go kind of parallel to you, Alison, in I think it is important to put the biggest effort in the platform that you're the best at, just because that also kind of, you know, makes your brand and your personality, and it really, you know, explain who you are as a person. So for example, I'll take a personal example. I'm a very creative person, so I fit better with Instagram than Twitter. But I do believe that it's important to have a presence in the main, or like all of the main, you know, social media platforms, just because you have a bigger reach. The only thing is, like, you have to be aware that repeating content, it's never a really good strategy for, you know, for your audience or for your fan base. So if you normally, like, your fans will be on some social medias for different goals, you know, they won't go to Twitter for the same reasons they go to Instagram, for example. So if you only make one type of content that is created for one specific social media, and then you just repost it on the other platforms, that's also not the best strategy. And that's also why I agree with Alison. So, but I think you need to be aware that you definitely need to build that presence over multiple social medias. So I think it's like something you start small. So maybe you start with one social media, and when you feel like you mastered it, then you try to shape your message in a different way, so it's better suited for another social media, for example. So I actually, my personal social media is a little bit low, but I also manage more, you know, established writers' social media. And that's kind of what we do. So, you know, they have a social media that is very specific to their own personal brand, but they also have a presence on other social medias. And obviously the efforts, or like the focus, is not, you know, on those other platforms, but they still have a presence that is designed for those platforms, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So I will say, just like sort of, obviously social media is it's trendy, you know, so it's shifting and it's changing, you know, on over time. And right now, you know, we're seeing sort of definitely a decline in Twitter and a rise in Instagram. So just in general, I think that would be sort of some information to have out there. But I agree 100% with everything that Alison and Gaby said in terms of picking a platform. And for sure, TikTok is kind of super important right now. But the audience that sort of that gets appealed to through TikTok tends to be slightly younger. I can say that, you know, with some of the teams that I've worked for in the past, that they will use, especially like the North American teams, more so than the European teams, which I think is something that Steve has been really good about helping us understand, as well as Gaby, is the European teams can be a little bit more old school in terms of how they operate and run, whereas some of the North American teams are definitely exploring new and different ways to leverage social media and engaging their athletes in that. And I think, you know, Rally Pro Cycling Team, which was previously Optum, is a super good example of that these days. They do an incredible job of having a really clear message in terms of who they are as an organization, and really engaging their riders in the process of telling stories online, and doing a really good job of that. And when you think about the structure of teams, you know, and we go back to, like, on the business side, you've got sort of some of your core administrative functions, and then you've got some of your marketing or business development functions. Circuit Sport, which is the management company that owns the Rally Pro Cycling Team, it's interesting. They actually have probably 7 people in their marketing, brand, and identity group, you know, sort of working with the athletes and preparing all of their media to tell their stories and make sure that their sponsors are promoted effectively through the team as a platform. So it's interesting to see how some teams take it really seriously and others maybe less so. Gab?
Yeah, I do have because actually I had a conversation with my new manager, or like general manager of my team. And we had a discussion about this, because the way that their design is a little bit different than maybe some other teams, in a sense that the team is owned by the main company, who's the title sponsor. But because it's owned by the title sponsor, the marketing department is detached from the team structure. So all of the marketing initiative, they're also running, you know, like sponsorship for some events that the team is participating in. They will be the ones also in charge of the team's, you know, not only social media, but just marketing strategy itself. And it was really interesting to me to hear about this because, it's also my study background. Like a team is we have to see it as a company. It has a social mission. And as a writer, it's important to know your team. Like Linda said, like you need to know the team and you need to understand that the team has a social mission. And maybe this is a good strategy to have as an athlete and how to build your social media and how to build your brand that aligns with a specific team, for example, that you really want, that aligns with that specific mission. So does it have more of a social, engagement mission or only performance, or, like it really depends on the different teams. But that's something to keep in mind that, like the teams, they don't only exist for winning bike races. They exist for other reasons. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. It totally makes sense. Yeah.
So,
And I think, again, like more and more you're seeing that, there are some teams that those teams that just bike race, they're sort of on the decline, and the teams that actually have a true and a real identity are the teams that are on the rise, and they're telling stories through the competitive sport they do. And they're actually starting to branch out more, and embrace athletes doing different types of activity, and so I think, I mentioned rally as a good example of that, but I think EF is a super good example of that too. It's like a pioneer in sort of alternative calendar and embracing their athletes doing other types of competition or just adventures, like the amazing thing about cycling is it's a sport that can kind of bring us together, and it's super social and it's really fun. And it's a great way to explore the world and feel free. And it's neat to see teams at the highest level of the sport starting to explore how they can tap into that, just sort of the freedom and the adventure of cycling. So, and I think that's going to be something that we're going to see more and more in the sport, actually, is teams doing that more often. I want to get back to some of our submitted questions, and I know we've got about maybe 7 minutes left to go. So I'm just going to quickly go through and see if there's a few things that we should touch upon that we haven't yet. And actually, it's unfortunate that Linda took off because there was a great question for her, but I'm going to get, it was Graham Howard sent in a really awesome question for Linda, and I'm going to get her to follow up with us on that. I guess I just want to get back to because for a lot of the athletes that are on the call right now, sort of progressing through the sport is super important. And there were lots of questions about getting out to teams, like how do I communicate with teams and what do I need to do? And through some of the questions and the conversations we've had today, a big thing that I was trying to draw out was the importance of how you present yourself. And I think Linda did an exceptional job of saying that it's really important to show a team how you can fit within that team, what you bring to that team. And then the next thing I would say, and that kind of came out in chatting with Steve and Linda, is the size of the look list that all the teams have. They're looking at a lot of athletes, and that you guys as athletes, you need to be super persistent in reaching out to those teams and be really proactive too. So communicate with lots of teams. And make sure that when you're communicating with all those teams, there's a little bit of an individualized approach to that team. So you've done even a little bit of background research and understanding who that team is, how many riders they currently have on the team, how many riders may or may not be on contract for the following season. And there's resources available for you guys to do that. And then when you see how you might fit inside that team, you can kind of tailor that initial approach. So you can actually make yourself stand out when you approach that team. And then you need to be really persistent about, and don't be, we had some really good questions about what's too pushy, like, is it like, how do you be careful about not being too pushy? And I would say, kind of touching back a little bit to what Steve said about using all your assets and even using social media, you know, to just keep, like, don't be afraid to be too pushy if you do it in a polite and an appropriate way. You know, so if you don't get a response, you know, you should never kind of sort of present yourself as being maybe a little bit angry or irritated that you're not, that nobody's getting back to you. Because again, I think it's a big area for teams to improve. They're notorious about not communicating back, but the messages do get read, like everybody's reading. And you can start to ask some questions, you know, that help you kind of can get a bit of an idea of where you fit inside the team. You know, so like what Linda and Steve said is that teams will actually create sort of tiers or categories of riders, you know. Ask directly, hey, you know, are you taking a look at me? Am I on your list? Where would I fall on that list? And don't be shy about a team getting back to you and saying you're not high on the list. Just because you're not high on the list this year doesn't mean you're not going to be higher on the list next year. You know, so I think another thing that's really important to understand, you know, from the top of the sport down to that initial sort of continental level, is that right now teams, you know, as sort of disorganized as Steve sort of mentioned that recruiting can be, they do look long, you know. So if you get your name in front of a team and you do a good job of developing a relationship with that team, whether it's through a little bit of engagement on social media or direct connection with the sporting director or the general manager of the team, seeing them at races, walking up and saying hi, like I sent my CV in, I communicated to you, we had this little quick exchange. You know, make sure that you're really persistent and polite about staying in front of those teams, because they will look long. You know, teams do actually recruit over a couple of years these days. Like it's not always, I'm just recruiting for next season. Like if you get yourself on the list and you can create even a small relationship with the team, they will pay attention the following year and the following year. So it can take a couple of years, but don't be shy about being really persistent. And don't ever feel that you're being too pushy, as long as you're being really polite about it and sort of framing your questions in those areas to sort of get a little bit more information about where you're sitting in terms of how the team is looking at you, but also what types of athletes the team is looking for, and understanding that teams sort of are actually looking at their athletes in those different categories of rider. Like, do I need a sprinter? Do I need climbers? Do I need support players? Do I need support players for these kinds of races or those kinds of races? Understanding how big your range is as a rider, you know, so the more versatile you are as a rider, the more different types of rider categories that you could sort of plop into or be productive at is super important as well, you know, for teams. Actually, Steve, maybe that would be a really good thing for us to sort of quickly tie it off on, is understanding the importance of versatility in the athletes inside of a team, and how you guys look at that in terms of athletes who have a big range versus a narrow or a very specific range of capability.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question, especially you know, at a world tour level. There's, you know, like I said, the guys do 75 races a year, right? Some are grand tour, some are individual, like one-day races, classics. But what you find is, you know, sometimes the guys that can win a grand tour stage can also win a classic, and they can win a world championship. So they're yeah, we all want Wout van Aerts, huh? We all want those guys. But yeah, and then there's also the other way, you know, where there's some very specific skill sets, right? You know, the guys that go fast the last 200 meters, but they have to be able to, you know, go 220 Ks to get to the last 200 meters and fight out for the sprint. But you know, those are specific assets that also teams want to find. You know, everybody would love to have a Michael Woods on their team too, because he's not only is he versatile, but he can climb. He can climb. He's versatile. He proved it in the Olympics. He could have won that race. So, these are super talents, obviously, but an all-round solid, strong athlete that has that team mentality. Like a Sven Tuft or a Hugo Hull, or some of the guys that sit on the front of the race and can do the job. They might not win as much, but they're also, an important component of a World Tour team. And those guys may be kind of the most versatile because they're in the game no matter what. You can put them anywhere, and then they're gonna do the job. I guess that's kind of a summation of versatility. Can time trial, can climb, can be a team man, can do the job, can do the work on the front. Even though they're not winning, they're a pretty important component.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And so for you guys as bikers, like when you're thinking about that too, try to also think about the results you have, the things that are going to make teams take a look at you, and try to sort of correlate it or tell a story about how it makes you a versatile rider, and how from the types of performances that you've demonstrated in the racing, it makes you capable of filling some other roles or work or jobs inside the team. And do a lot of talking about your durability as well. So like Steve said, and I know Linda's not here, but the numbers in terms of race days that teams are looking at for bikers, it's like 50, 65, up to 80, like Steve said, in the World Tour. For the Women's World Tour, it's slightly less. It's like 50 to 60 days. But even in terms of domestic teams, like in North America, in those first level of Conti teams, you're looking at 30 to 50 days. So you need to be able to communicate to teams that you can actually be sort of a high functioning contributor within the team over the breadth of the season, and so how you can do that and how the results you have make you capable of filling roles and doing jobs in other areas that the team's going to need. All right, we're almost at time, and I'm going to wrap it up by going back to our panelists with the killer question. So after everything we've talked about today, Gaby, what would be the one single most important thing you think athletes need to know about the business of cycling?
I'm gonna take another kind of twist on what you said. I think that the most important thing nowadays is that there needs to be a switch in the business model of cycling, and how it exists at the moment, especially with the World Tour men's cycling. And the reason why it kind of is a bit twist on your, like the women's cycling, is that women's cycling, although it has some history, it isn't at a point where it actually can choose its business model, where men's cycling is a much bigger structure, so they don't have this opportunity, or it's going to be a lot harder for it to change, because we're shaping women's cycling at the moment. You can actually shape it in a different way than men's cycling, and make it more profitable, not only for the teams but also for the athletes.
Alison, what would you say is the single most important thing?
I would say, taking charge of what you want to see, happen in your sport and in your life, and being strategic about it, setting, clear goals and objectives of what you want to achieve. And then knowing that I think sport is evolving and it's changing, and there is an opportunity for the athlete to, build up these other assets, your relationships, your social, your, all these other things. And eventually you can use that to negotiate. So I think, you have more power than, past generations had. And it's totally up to you, if that's what you want to take on, and, put in the work and put in the effort to see those results for yourself.
Steve, what would you say?
Oh man, I need to think about that one.
Steve, you had like 3 days to think about it.
Yeah, I'm with at the professional level, I'm with Gaby. We need to blow up get the World Tour teams, call it stakeholds together on a better future, for the business of the sport. If you're talking about the business of the sport,
Yeah.
It's been too long in the, use, Gabby and Mike's term, old school, management, and UCI having control over too much, and also ASO and the Tour de France. Like, there's just no balance for the biggest stakeholder, which is the teams, which is like around $400 million annually stakeholder that the teams raise, right, in sponsorship. So that's it's a big nut that's not really has a good like a collective collective voice. That's the word.
Yeah. So I would agree. I do think, and I think it's kind of a big topic inside cycling, that the whole model needs a big shakeup. And I'll just sort of tie it off by saying that's why I think there's so much opportunity with the Women's World Tour right now, because it's fairly greenfield, and there's the opportunity to really create some real genuine change that can really be beneficial to the entire sport in that area. And on the men's side, we've got some of these entrenched groups and stakeholders that are just sort of kind of fighting to keep their piece of the pie, instead of thinking about how everybody can work together to make the pie different or make it bigger. So
don't let the men screw it up.
Yeah.
Just learn from the women.
Yeah. All right. So I want to thank all of our panelists today for coming on and sharing your insights and your experiences and knowledge in the sport. I think this was an important one, and we kind of were fairly expansive. I'm going to try to wrap it all up into a nice, concise post that we can put up on the Bridge the Gap website. And like I said, we did record this one, so it's going to be a long one, but we'll post the entirety of today's session on YouTube. So everyone can go back to it and sort of like fast forward to specific segments and see what they like. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to our panelists for sharing their time with us today. Hope you guys enjoyed it.